In the cold, endless void of space, a mysterious SOS echoed across the stars. A desperate plea for help from a world lost to time. The Deathworlder fleet, masters of survival in a universe of harsh realities, responded, drawn by the faint hope of salvation. But what they found wasn't a world seeking rescue. It was a world that had already fallen, its silent sentinels, eerie whispers, and unsettling shadows waiting for them in the fog. Little did they know, the signal had led them to something far more terrifying than they had ever feared. In the vast, cold reaches of space, where the stars stretched endlessly in every direction like a cosmic graveyard, the fleet of Deathworlders drifted aimlessly, their journey a slow, unending march through the void. These beings, survivors from worlds far harsher than the one they had fled, had become masters of survival. Their very existence was forged in the fires of adversity, each generation tougher than the last, each survivor scarred by struggle. Their home, once a planet of brutal beauty and endless peril, had long since become uninhabitable. Now they wandered the void, their once proud armada reduced to a smattering of weary, fragmented ships, each crew clinging to the hope that somewhere out there lay a new home. But that hope had faded like the light from a dying star. The vastness of space was a cruel vacuum, swallowing their dreams and leaving only the cold, endless hum of their drifting fleet. They were explorers without purpose, travelers with no destination. Their numbers dwindled, not just from the inevitable decay of their physical forms, but from the crushing weight of hopelessness. They were lost, but they had become experts in survival, if not hope. Then, it happened. A faint, crackling signal emerged from the void, slipping through the void like a whisper from another world. It was distant, weak, and unmistakably alien. A call for help, desperate, primal, and filled with a plea so raw, so urgent, it could not be ignored. At first they thought it was just another ghost of the cosmos, some stray anomaly from a distant, forgotten planet. Another dead star blinking in the dark, only to fade again, but there was something different this time. This wasn't just a random static, it was purpose-driven, it was alive. The fleet, still fractured and lost in their endless drifting, stopped as one. They had all heard it, deep within the silence of their own minds. They might have been broken, scattered, and disillusioned, but they knew one thing: survival was all they knew. And now, for the first time in ages, there was a flicker of hope, though weak, though distant, though laughably unlikely. There was hope. It was faint like a candle flame in a hurricane, but hope nonetheless. Should we answer? One of the crew members asked, though no one could remember who. Perhaps they had all spoken at once. Answer? Another murmured, his voice filled with disbelief. With what? A reply of silence? What will that do? But there was no denying it. Hope had gripped them. Even the most hardened of their number, those who had long given up, began to whisper quietly, their hollow voices filled with a strange, unshakable resolve. They had nothing left to lose. The signal was not going to be ignored. No one was willing to let another chance slip through their grasp. Maybe, someone finally said, maybe they're not as dead as we thought. There was no laughter in the void, no warmth, only the echo of his words vanishing into the cold. But somehow, that thought carried weight. They weren't as dead as they'd thought. So they sent their reply, a fragile beacon, a quiet signal of hope in the vast emptiness. A desperate cry, not for survival, but for something even rarer: connection. The fleet, scattered and weary, had no way of knowing if anyone would ever hear their return, let alone if they would ever arrive. Yet they sent it anyway, because even Deathworlders knew better than to turn their backs on a chance at life, no matter how slim. Now they would wait. The source of the signal was distant so far that the idea of reaching it felt more like a fantasy than a reality. But for Deathworlders, distance was merely a question of time. Time was what they had in abundance. Survival taught them patience, and patience taught them persistence. So they sent their probes into the void, guided by the faint hope that the signal wasn't just another faint whisper of lost hope, lost time, lost worlds. As the probes drifted deeper into the emptiness, the nothingness surrounding them began to shift. Distances that once felt infinite started to shrink. Their sensors strained, their engines hummed, and their navigational lights flickered through the darkness. And then they found something they hadn't expected. A world alive, not a barren rock, not some faint echo of emptiness, but teeming with life. The probe sent back images of land unlike anything the Deathworlders had ever encountered. It was harsh, hostile, far more unwelcoming than the world they had left behind. The atmosphere was thick, filled with poisonous gases that made breathing feel like a crime. Violent storms raged across the surface, tearing apart anything that dared stand still. Yet, despite this brutal environment, life clung to existence, defying the very concept of habitability. It wasn't the kind of life they had known, strange, alien, and thriving in ways the Deathworlders couldn't comprehend. The flora wasn't lush, nor was the fauna anything resembling what they had seen before. No creatures with humanoid forms, no beasts with familiar shapes. These were organisms beyond their understanding, mutated by an unforgiving planet. The life on this world was something entirely other, something that shouldn't have existed at all. Amidst the chaos, they uncovered something even more bizarre. Structures, towering ruins of once proud cities, their edges eroded by time and nature. These weren't just small settlements either. No, these were vast metropolises, half buried beneath mountains of debris, their once mighty spires reduced to crumbling shadows of their former selves. The stone and metal had given way to decay and nature, but the shape of civilization was unmistakable. This wasn't some forgotten wasteland. This was a world that had once been alive, thriving. A civilization that had once stood proud, now lost to the relentless forces of nature. The source of the SOS had come from here, from this desolate, twisted world. The question that plagued the fleet wasn't what had happened to these ruins. No. The real question was, where had the inhabitants gone? If they had built cities like these, if they had thrived here, how could they be gone? There was no sign of them in the ruins, no echo of their existence. They had vanished, leaving behind nothing but questions and the faint, unanswered cry for help. Some wondered if the SOS had been a desperate attempt by the last remnants of that civilization, an act of defiance from a people who had accepted their fate but refused to let go of hope. Others, more cynical, believed it was the last whisper of a dying species, desperate to avoid their own oblivion. But whatever the truth, the fleet knew one thing: the signal wasn't just a call for help. It was a warning. A warning of something far worse than mere extinction. For as they scoured the ruins, walking through the remnants of streets paved in ancient stone, the Deathworlders couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, flickering in and out of the gloom. Figures moved in the distance, distorted by the endless storms. Were they illusions? Hallucinations brought on by the toxic atmosphere? Or were they something more, something that had survived? The fleet dared not voice their fears, but the whispers in their minds grew louder. If a civilization could fall, what of their own? How much longer could they endure this endless void, this hopeless search? The source of the SOS wasn't a beacon of salvation. It was a warning from a world where life had adapted in ways no one had foreseen, a world that had conquered its death, only to become something far more dangerous. They had found the world they were searching for, but they were no longer sure what they had come to save. As the fleet drew closer to the Deathworld, they were greeted by something far more unsettling than they had anticipated: statues. Great, towering figures stood frozen in time, their faces locked in expressions of anguish and despair. These weren't mere monuments, remnants of a long-forgotten civilization. No, they were sentinels, silent guardians, monuments to a world that had long since slipped into oblivion. At first they appeared lifeless. Massive and monolithic, they loomed over the ruins like ancient ghosts. But as the fleet drew nearer, a strange feeling began to take root. It wasn't just their size or their eerily preserved condition that was unsettling, it was the way they seemed to watch. Not with eyes, not with visible features, but as though they were aware of something beyond the veil of time. The fleet stopped, their instruments scanning for any sign of life, only to return with nothing but static. Static? Someone muttered, their voice trembling. Static? The statues remained motionless, their forms etched in stone, yet somehow they radiated an oppressive sense of presence. The very air around them seemed charged with something unnatural. These weren't just statues, they were sentinels of a civilization that had vanished long before the Deathworlders had even been born. Their gaze, though silent, felt disturbingly alive, unblinking and unyielding. "We're not alone," someone said, though no one wanted to believe it. The atmosphere grew thicker, heavier. The fleet's sensors detected no life forms, but something told them that wasn't the whole story. The statues weren't lifeless. They were something more, something that had endured, something that had watched. "Do statues watch?" one of them asked, his voice cracking. "Statues," another replied, "aren't supposed to watch. They're supposed to stand there, quiet, dead." But these weren't statues in the traditional sense. They weren't relics of history, they were silent sentinels guarding a world that refused to die. The longer the fleet stared at them, the more unnerving it became. They didn't seem to belong to the past. They belonged to now, to this very moment. "What if they're not statues?" someone whispered. "What if they're something else?" The thought hung in the air like the oppressive fog that clung to the Deathworld's surface. The sentinels were monuments, sure, but they were also watchers. Observers. They didn't move, they didn't speak, but something about their stillness felt far from still. It was as if they were waiting for something or someone. "Maybe they're waiting for us," another voice suggested, quieter this time. A tremor of fear threaded through the fleet as the realization sank in. The statues weren't lifeless guardians. They were guardians of something far worse than death. Some aboard wondered if the SOS had been a final, desperate act of a long-extinct people, one last cry before they vanished into the void. Yet the strange structures, the silent sentinels, didn't confirm that theory. They suggested something far more unsettling. This world wasn't truly empty. It wasn't lifeless. It was just waiting for something. The fleet struggled to grasp what they were seeing, what they were feeling. The statues seemed to reject the notion of death, rejecting the very idea of oblivion. They had stood there through countless storms, through centuries of silence, and they weren't broken. They weren't decayed. They were intact, immobile, yet unmistakably present. "We're not alone," someone whispered again. This wasn't the absence of life. It was something else. Something they couldn't explain, and something they didn't want to admit. The statues had become more than just monuments. They were sentinels guarding a mystery that could devour them if they weren't careful. One of the crew tapped the console nervously, his fingers hovering over the controls, but his mind was far away, lost in the eerie stillness of the statues. "Are they still watching?" he asked, his voice trembling. No one answered, because they all knew the answer. Yes, they were still watching. Not as dead as they appeared. Not as lifeless as they seemed. This world wasn't empty. It was waiting. For them. As the fleet descended into the Deathworld's atmosphere, the fog rose to greet them like a living, breathing entity. It wasn't the harmless mist of a serene morning. It was dense, oppressive, and unyielding. The tendrils of vapor coiled around their ships, clinging to their hulls like phantom hands. It swallowed the light, devouring visibility until nothing remained but the ghostly outlines of their own vessels. Even the brightest beams from their searchlights could barely cut through the murk, leaving the Deathworlders cocooned in a claustrophobic void. Their instruments, so reliable in the vacuum of space, were now little more than paperweights. Sensors failed to provide readings, navigation systems sputtered with static, and proximity alarms wailed in protest at nothingness. It was as if the fog had rewritten the rules of existence, rendering all their technology powerless. The Deathworlders, once masters of survival, suddenly felt like prey. "This isn't fog," one muttered. "This is a trap." Though no one wanted to voice it, the thought crept into every mind. The fog didn't behave naturally. It moved with intention, swirling in intricate patterns, opening and closing paths as though it were deciding who could pass. The fleet, battered but resilient, pushed forward. They had braved storms, voids, and death itself. They would not be undone by mere mist. Or so they thought. The fog wasn't just a barrier, it was a mirror for the mind. Shadows began to emerge within it, dark, shifting figures that danced at the edges of perception. At first, they seemed like tricks of the light, fleeting silhouettes caused by strained eyes. But as they persisted, lingering longer and growing more defined, the Deathworlders began to question what they were seeing. "What shadows?" someone said, their voice trembling, as if by denying them they could make them disappear. But the shadows didn't need acknowledgement. They were already there, and they weren't going anywhere. The figures moved with an unsettling grace, flickering in and out of the fog. They weren't reflections, there was nothing to reflect. They weren't illusions, no machine or mind could conjure something so tangible. The shadows were real, and they were watching. Always at the edge of vision, just out of reach, they moved as though testing the limits of their observer's sanity. "This is fine," one of the fleet members quipped nervously, his voice cracking. "This is totally fine. Shadows in the fog, great, just what we needed," but the humor was hollow, a flimsy shield against the growing dread. The fleet pressed on, though their unity began to waver. The fog played tricks not only on their eyes but on their minds. Whispers echoed within the mist, faint, indistinct murmurs that seemed to come from every direction and none at all. Were they real? Were they hallucinations? The Deathworlders couldn't tell. But the whispers carried a weight, a resonance that suggested they weren't born of imagination. "Keep moving," someone urged, though it was unclear if they were speaking to the crew or to themselves. Movement felt like the only answer. To stop was to surrender, and surrender was not in their nature. Then came the first clear sighting. One of the ships reported seeing a figure, a tall, spindly shape that stood motionless amidst the fog. It didn't flee when the ship's lights fell upon it. Instead, it lingered, unflinching, as though it were studying the observers as intently as they studied it. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the mist as though it had never existed. "What was that?" someone whispered, though the question was rhetorical. There was no answer. There couldn't be. More figures appeared, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, their movements deliberate yet erratic. They didn't rush or lunge, they didn't attack. They simply existed, their presence enough to unsettle even the most stoic of the Deathworlders. Were they remnants of the fallen civilization, ghosts of a world that had consumed itself? Or were they something entirely alien, something the Deathworlders couldn't begin to understand? Speculation ran rampant. Some believed the figures were the source of the SOS, the last survivors of the civilization that had once thrived here. Others thought they were predators, luring the fleet into the fog for reasons unknown. A few dared to wonder if the shadows were the civilization itself, no longer human, no longer alive, but something caught between states. The truth remained elusive, hidden within the swirling fog. But one thing was clear, the Deathworlders were no longer just visitors. They were participants in a game they didn't understand, with rules they couldn't see and opponents they couldn't predict. The shadows in the fog weren't just watching, they were waiting. And whatever they were waiting for, the fleet was certain they wouldn't like the answer. Amidst the swirling fog, the fleet began to hear the whispers. At first they were faint, no more than a subtle hum at the edges of perception, easily dismissed as the creaks and groans of stressed hulls or the hiss of static and failing communication systems. But the sound persisted, growing louder with each passing moment. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't the wind. It was something else entirely. The whispers didn't come from one direction, they came from everywhere. Like echoes rebounding off invisible walls, they seemed to surround the fleet, slipping through cracks in reality itself. They weren't voices in the conventional sense, there were no words, no discernible language, but they carried an unsettling rhythm, a cadence that hinted at meaning just beyond comprehension. Okay, one crew member thought to themselves, gripping the edge of their console a little too tightly. Whispers from the void, totally normal. Nothing weird about that. But the joke wasn't funny, even in their own head. As the fleet pressed deeper into the Deathworld's atmosphere, the whispers grew louder, sharper, more intrusive. They didn't just fill the air, they seeped into thoughts, coiling around minds like invisible tendrils. Some tried to ignore them, brushing them off as stress-induced paranoia. After all, fear had a way of making shadows darker and sounds louder. But others weren't so sure. The whispers felt deliberate, intentional, as though someone or something was trying to speak directly to them. "I'm fine," one of them muttered under their breath, trying to drown out the whispers with the sound of their own voice. But it didn't work. The whispers weren't just in the air, they were inside. Inside their minds, their thoughts, their very being. What made it worse was how strangely familiar the whispers felt. They didn't carry words or phrases anyone could recognize, yet they resonated in a way that felt intimate, like a forgotten memory stirring at the edges of awareness. It was as if the whispers were speaking a language they had once known, long ago in a life they couldn't remember. The fleet was not immune to fear, but they were not prone to panic either. Years of surviving the harshest conditions had hardened them against terror. But this was different. This wasn't a storm or a predator or an enemy they could fight. This was something intangible, something that preyed on the very fabric of their reality. As the whispers grew in intensity, some aboard the fleet began to experience flashes of something. Images that weren't their own, memories that didn't belong to them. Fractured glimpses of a world consumed by chaos, of figures running through crumbling streets, of skies burning with unnatural light. The images came and went like lightning, leaving behind a sense of dread that refused to fade. This isn't paranoia, someone thought, their grip tightening on the controls. This is something else. The whispers were no longer content to remain faint and insidious. They began to take on a sharper edge, a keening cry that resonated deep within the core of their ships. It was as though the Deathworld itself was screaming, its agony bleeding into the minds of those who dared to intrude upon it. Some aboard the fleet began to falter, their resolve cracking under the weight of the whispers. They heard cries anguished, desperate, pleading. Cries that sounded almost human, almost like their own. But they weren't human. They couldn't be. Could they? Theories abounded, each more terrifying than the last. Were they hearing the echoes of the ancient civilization that had once thrived on this world, voices frozen in time and now unleashed by their arrival? Or were the whispers something far more sinister, something born of the Deathworld itself, a warning or perhaps a trap? I don't think about it, one of them whispered to themselves, trying to push the voices away. Just focus. Keep moving. But ignoring the whispers was impossible. They didn't just exist in the air around them, they wormed their way into thoughts, unraveling the boundaries between reality and imagination. What was real? What wasn't? The distinction grew blurrier with each passing moment, and the Deathworlders, so accustomed to facing tangible threats, found themselves utterly unprepared for this battle of the mind. The fleet pressed on, driven by a mixture of determination and desperation. The whispers had become cries, and the cries carried with them an unmistakable weight. They weren't just sounds, they were feelings, grief, anger, fear, and something else. Something darker, something that hinted at an unfathomable truth buried within the fog. The Deathworlders weren't just hearing voices. They were hearing the Deathworld itself. And whatever it was trying to say, one thing was clear: it didn't want them there. The fleet pushed deeper, the fog folding around them like a suffocating shroud. But this time, the whispers were no longer vague. They were shouts now raw, anguished, and unrelentingly human. Each sound carried a weight that dug into the mind, a voice that seemed to scream directly into the soul. For beings as hardened as the Deathworlders, fear was no stranger. Yet this wasn't fear. It was something far worse. It was recognition. The statues, which had loomed lifelessly in their eerie stillness, now seemed anything but inanimate. At first, the movements were subtle, a shift here, a tremble there. But as the shouts rose to a crescendo, the fleet watched in mounting horror as the once static sentinels began to animate fully. What had once been faces of stone chiseled into expressions of quiet despair, now twisted and writhed with emotion. Eyes that had been mere carvings now gleamed, glowing faintly with an unholy light that cut through the dense mist. The Deathworlders, masters of logic and resilience, stood powerless against the grotesque ballet unfolding before them. The statues didn't simply move, they reacted, their bodies creaking and groaning as though breaking free from eons of stasis. Each step they took sent vibrations rippling through the ground, their massive forms exuding an oppressive presence that crushed the air around them. They moved in unison, as if guided by a singular, unfathomable will. Okay, one observer thought grimly, gripping their console for support. Statues moving. Sure, why not? Just add that to the list of nightmares. And then came the shadows. The fog, so thick and oppressive, began to thin, unraveling like a veil being drawn back. What it revealed was no solace. The shadows that had danced at the periphery of vision now stepped forward, fully formed and terrifyingly alive. They were grotesque amalgamations of limbs and forms, their bodies pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. Each figure seemed to defy biology, their shapes shifting and blending as though the very concept of stability was foreign to them. The ruins of the civilization, which had seemed so desolate and abandoned, now erupted with life, if such a word could even apply to what emerged. Structures crumbled further as creatures spilled forth, their movements jerky and alien, yet filled with purpose. They clawed their way out of the wreckage, pulling themselves free like nightmares birthing into reality. The Deathworlders watched, their minds racing to make sense of the horror before them. Were these the remnants of the civilization that had once thrived here, warped by millennia of survival on a hostile planet? Or were they something far worse, descendants of the beings who had sent the SOS, twisted by forces beyond comprehension? The fog had not been a barrier, it had been a cocoon shielding these creatures from the outside world. And now the fleet's presence had torn it open, awakening something that had been dormant for untold ages. Something that had waited, watched, and endured. The shouts grew louder, a cacophony of rage and anguish that reverberated through the ruins. It wasn't just noise, it was communication, an expression of pain so intense it transcended language. The Deathworlders couldn't understand the words, but they didn't need to. The emotions were clear grief, anger, and a hunger that defied description. The fleet scrambled to regroup, their instincts screaming at them to flee, but fleeing was no longer an option. The creatures moved with impossible speed, surrounding the ships with an efficiency that suggested they weren't acting on impulse but strategy. The Deathworlders had faced countless predators before, but never had they encountered anything so deliberate, so calculating. The planet itself seemed to shift, as if it were alive and responding to the awakening. The ground trembled, splitting open to reveal glowing fissures that pulsed with a sickly light. The air grew heavier, charged with an energy that prickled at the edges of perception. The Deathworld wasn't just a setting, it was an active participant, and it had no intention of letting its visitors leave. Among the chaos, one thought kept recurring in the minds of the Deathworlders. This was no accident. The Sessa hadn't been a desperate cry for help. It had been a lure, a beacon designed to draw them in. But why? To save these creatures? To join them? Or to become their next prey? The realization hit like a thunderclap. They hadn't stumbled upon the ruins of a dead civilization. They had invaded the territory of a living one, a civilization that had adapted to survive in a way no one could have imagined. The Deathworlders, who had always prided themselves on their resilience, now found themselves outmatched by beings whose very existence was a testament to survival in the face of the impossible. The statues, the shadows, the creatures, they were all connected, part of a singular, horrifying truth. The Deathworld wasn't a world at all. It was a trap, a predator in planetary form, and the fleet had walked straight into its jaws. The fleet hung on the edge of disaster, their mighty armada reduced to a collection of vulnerable targets in the face of the Deathworld's relentless hostility. The once proud Deathworlders, veterans of countless struggles, now found themselves at the mercy of a force that defied understanding. The revelation came not with fanfare, but with the crushing weight of inevitability. They had not been the hunters, they had always been the hunted. The statues, the shadows, the whispers, all of it had been a tapestry of warnings woven into the very fabric of this world. The alien SOS had been their undoing. It wasn't a cry for rescue, but a plea to stay away, a desperate signal cast into the void by a civilization that had long since learned the cost of staying too close. But curiosity, that ever-present trait of the Deathworlders, had led them here. Now they stood at the precipice of their greatest mistake. The fog thinned just enough to reveal the creatures in all their terrible glory. They were grotesque, alien amalgamations of biology and nightmare, their forms shifting and contorting as though they were not bound by the rules of the universe. Eyes glowed like molten stars, and limbs moved with a jerky precision that suggested intelligence behind their horrifying appearances. The fleet had encountered predators before, but these beings were something else entirely. They were predators of predators, a step above anything the Deathworlders had faced. This is bad, one thought bitterly. Not the grab a gun and fight your way out bad. This is the I should have stayed in bed today kind of bad. The creatures advanced in unison, their movements synchronized with the rhythmic pulse of the glowing fissures below. It was as though the planet itself was their ally, each tremor and flare of light signaling their next step. The Deathworld wasn't just alive, it was a conductor, and these horrors were its symphony. The fleet had interrupted the melody, and now they were being played as instruments of destruction. Attempts at retaliation were swift but fruitless. The fleet's advanced weaponry, capable of carving through asteroids and starships alike, had little effect. Energy beams fizzled against the creatures as though they were swatting away flies. Explosions sent shockwaves rippling through the fog, but when the smoke cleared, the creatures stood unharmed, their twisted forms barely flinching. It was like trying to fight the ocean with a bucket. Panic began to spread, though the Deathworlders tried to maintain composure. Survival had always been their defining trait, but survival required understanding, and this enemy defied comprehension. How do you fight shadows that refuse to be bound by light? How do you defeat beings that seem to exist outside the very rules of reality? The whispers returned, louder and clearer now. They weren't just noises, they were memories, fragments of lives once lived on this cursed world. The Deathworlders saw glimpses of the past, the rise of the civilization that had called this place home, their triumphs, their innovations, their inevitable descent. The planet had not always been this way. It had been a thriving, vibrant world, its people masters of their domain. But something had changed, something profound and irreversible. The planet had turned on them. In their desperation, they had sent the SOS a message not of hope but of despair. This wasn't a rescue mission, one thought grimly. This was a tomb raid, and were the next bodies. The creatures didn't attack outright. They didn't need to. Their very presence was an assault on the senses, an overwhelming pressure that crushed the will to fight. The Deathworlders, so used to standing tall in the face of danger, now found themselves on their knees. The weight of the planet's history, its suffering, its anger, it was too much. And then, the final revelation came. The Deathworld itself was the creature. The fog, the fissures, the shadows, the whispers, they were all extensions of a singular, sentient entity. This wasn't just a hostile environment, it was a predator in planetary form. The alien SOS hadn't been sent by survivors, it had been sent by the planet itself, a lure to draw in prey foolish enough to answer the call. The Deathworlders, for all their resilience and ingenuity, had finally met a force they couldn't overcome. The planet didn't just consume flesh, it consumed minds, memories, and identities. It was a devourer of everything, leaving behind nothing but echoes. As the first of the creatures closed in, its eyes blazing with an insatiable hunger, the Deathworlders knew there was no escape. They had found a world that had already died, a world that had turned its death into a weapon. And now, they would become part of it, their stories swallowed by the same darkness that had consumed all who came before. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Sci-Fi Horizon Stories for more thrilling tales of science fiction and adventure.